Everyone, Wazoo here, and it is time for another fancy schmancy episode of the Raylib 2D ASCII RPG project. I think it's time we start with episode 8. In our previous episode, let's just give a little recap of where we left off. I broke combat, but what we ended up achieving was loading our map from a file and then having a camera that is centered and focused on our player. So while I was planning out this episode, I saw a handy comment on one of the previous videos. The suggestion here was we should implement a basic XP system that gives experience when you kill a monster. I like that. I think that's a good one to implement in this episode. We are going to fix up combat. We're going to track player XP. We're going to maybe display it for the player. This is going to be sort of a lot of things happening at once. So let's dive into the project. The code that we're going to be building, again, is linked in the description down below. It's available on my GitHub. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to fix up a few things while we're fixing up combat. So in our project.h, remember we've got our map structure that contains the tile map for our overworld, what I'm going to call the overworld. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a list of enemies that are going to be in that overworld as well. So we're going to create a enemy structure and then an array here to keep track of the enemies. And then so we're going to have an int number of enemies. And we already have the enemy thing here. So we're going to add a few different variables here as well. We're going to add an XP value. We're going to add an X and Y position and a tile for each enemy. Okay, and for our player, let's just clean this up a bit. We're going to have a int X and int Y, and then we're going to track the XP. That'll be cool. And then let's declare, okay, so we've got a max enemies of 3 already. So let's maybe make that 10. So underneath our map, let's create a new structure called monster template. So we're going to keep track of a monster name, the maximum hit points they have, an attack value, and the symbol. And then basically, this is basically like a monster generator. So these are types of monsters that we can have in our game so far. So we've got a goblin, an orc, a slime, a troll, and a wraith. Remember, this is sort of stuff that we've worked before with on the combat system. So we're just moving that into the project.h main header here. Okay, which means we're going to clean this up from our monster.c file, from our combat.c file, sorry. Okay, so we're going to rename this array to combat enemies. So basically what I'm going to do is update the way that we are initializing combat. So since we're going to be tracking enemies on the map and within the combat screen, then the idea that I'm playing around with is that when we enter combat, we copy the data from the map enemies array into this combat enemies array that we're using for this combat system that we've got implemented so far. And let's create some new variables here. We'll keep track of where the player X and Y is in the overworld, as well as a total combat experience. Okay, so let's update this startup combat. What we want to pass in is the current world position X and current world position Y, and a pointer to our enemy. Okay, so let's update the startup combat declaration here. Okay, and then what we want to do is save that overworld player X equals current world position X, and overworld player Y equals current world position Y. So we want to keep track of where the player was when they entered combat. Okay, and so then let's clear out the existing combat enemies that are in our array, that array that we've declared up here. Basically, we'll just set all of them to the alive flag on all of them to false. And we haven't declared this max combat enemies variable yet, so let's do that now back in the project.h. And I'm going to say a max combat enemies of 3. Okay, so all of them are false. They are no longer alive. And so our enemy count is going to be a get random value from 1 to max combat enemies. Okay, and let's rework this whole. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to copy in our enemy values that we've passed into this function. We're going to loop through the enemy count that we have in our current little array, and we're going to copy everything into that new array. And we're going to assign an XP value of between 10 and 50. We're going to copy in the enemy name, the tile ID, the tile data, the max HP, the enemy's HP, their attack value, and that they're alive. That would help. So then down in our update combat, so this do while loop is no longer going to work. So instead of enemies, we want to use that combat enemies, and the rest of this statement should work, as well as when we use the right key to cycle through our targets, we're again looking at the combat underscore enemies. So now if the A key is pressed, we want to reference the combat enemies array of the current enemy index. The rest of this should still work. And then if our target's health is less than 0, then that means they're dead. And so we should increase now our total combat experience. We want to increase it by the current target XP. Okay, and then if we flee, remember how we've got this fix me to do here. So this is what we'll address right now. We want to return to the area on the overworld map. So let's create a function called restore player to overworld. And we'll use that stored values within the overworld player X and overworld player Y, as well as the total combat experience. And let's start with that. Okay, so restore player to overworld. In this combat turn monster turn, remember how we have this enemies alive, which is no longer called enemies, it's combat enemies. So when it's the monster's turn, then we're just going to cycle through the enemies that are in the list. Let's fix up all of these references to combat enemies. Okay, so now the victory state. So if combat enemies are alive, then all enemies dead or false. And if not, combat enemies, then assign the current enemy index to be the current array index value. Okay, and then, so if all enemies are dead, we have defeated all the enemies. Let's fix up this to-do. I'm glad we left this here. So again, we want to return to the map, and we have now won and defeated the enemies, so there should be no more monster. So let's restore player to overworld, which is what we'll create at overworld player X, overworld player Y, total combat experience. Okay, now we've got a case that we'll have to deal with. I'm not quite sure yet how we're going to do it, but we've got a case since we're using the same function in two places. So one is when we flee from battle, and one is when we win the battle. And so there has to be some kind of way of, if we flee the battle, then we preserve the monsters that are there. We don't get rid of them. And if we win the battle, then we want to make sure that there are now no more monsters on that map location. Okay, so then let's go into this combat screen here. This combat screen, draw combat screen function here, and let's fix up this reference here to what we're displaying. So basically reference that combat enemies array instead of enemies array. Okay, and let's start with this. Go into game, and so in game reset, let's go ahead and reset the player's XP. Or after we draw the player, sorry. So we're in the state map, so we're in that overworld map. Let's now create a function to draw the player stats. So this will be like XP, health, I don't know, money, that kind of thing. So we'll pass in a pointer to our player information. Okay, so in map.c, we are going to have to declare, or let's clean up this draw map. We're not using that anymore here. And we're not using this. Well, we'll keep it there for now until we clean that up. Okay, so we have got that new function. Oh, let's get rid of all this. Okay, we're commenting that out. It's not being used anyway. So this is our map loading code, and this is our get the color from the tile. Okay, sorry, I'm scrolling pretty fast down here. So let's create that restore player to overworld. So void restore player to overworld. And we're receiving the overworld player X and overworld player Y, along with the total combat experience. So before we flesh this out, let's cut and paste this to our project.h in our map right here. Okay. So we want to restore our player to the overworld. And so if there's no game current map, then we return. Okay, we don't have a reference to that, so let's fix that up shortly. Okay, so let's, first of all, we'll increase the player XP by the total combat experience value. Okay, and then what we'll do is, so we'll take the overworld player X value and we'll get a random value between -1 and 1, and we'll create a new Y placement within the overworld. Between X and Y, where we started the combat, but then we're going to just randomly move them a little bit after the combat is finished, and I'll show you why shortly. So let's assign player X to be equal new X and player.Y to equal new Y. And so we need a reference to game current map. Okay, so let's update our project.h with extern map game current map. And I think we've declared that in game. Okay, yeah, we've declared that in game as game current map. Okay. So we need a draw player stats function. So let's create that in player.c. So we've got update player. We're going to fix that to do shortly, but let's first create that draw player stats. And we're passing in a pointer to the player. Okay, so basically we're going to calculate a position for the new text. We're going to be just past the border of that camera area on the right there, and then we're going to just display the player XP value as a integer in yellow. So that looks okay. Let's see what we're missing here. Okay, combat enemies. Okay, so that's undeclared. So startup combat. So we have to fix up how we're referencing that. I think in update player, where's update player? Okay, here we go. Update player within the player.c file. Yeah. So we're going to be, remember how we've got some little logic here for if we are going to run into the boundaries of the map, then prevent it from happening. What we are going to do here is remove this to do. We want to test if we're going to encounter any of the enemies. So int enemy count equals the current map, number of enemies. Okay, so we're going to do a for loop of the number of enemies at the current position in our map. And if our enemy is true, then we want to calculate the X and Y. We want to test if the player is going to bump into them. Then we want to change the game state to state combat, which we've covered before, and call our startup combat with the new variables. So player X, player Y, the position of the player, and the enemies, a pointer to the enemies at that map location. Okay, and then since we've got these additional monsters, GOSTW, we need to add those into our into this thing right here. So I've come up with some other colors. So if it's a G, then we return a purple. O is dark green, S is green, and T is green. And then if we've got a W, return a dark gray. Okay, here we go. So we have to update the map loading here. So what I want to do is, normally in a RPG, well, what I would think is normal is that maybe the M on the map data is not the monster itself, but it's more of a spot where we randomly generate a monster. And so what I'm going to attempt to do here is in that enemies array that we're tracking as part of the map is to randomly generate, say, between 1 and 3 or something like that, whenever it encounters an M during the map loading. So that way, when you go into combat, then you'll again be faced with between 1 and X number of enemies instead of just a 1-to-1 thing here. So I'll show you what I mean. So for our map here, let's declare our number of enemies to be 0. Let's initialize that. And then down here, in this map stuff, in this map loading as we're going through each line, so else if line call equals M for monster, then what we want to do is map tiles row call data equals dot. So we just want to replace that M with a dot. Map tiles row call ID of 1. And then we want to spawn an enemy at this location. So spawn monster from map to map. Sorry, not from map. Spawn monster to map. Passing in the map and the call and the row. And then what we're going to need we need to update the monsters within the map data as well, within the view, our new viewport. So after the for loop,
where we go through the view total width and total height. We're going to do another one under here where we go through the number of we go through the enemies attached to the current map. And so then what we're going to do is if the enemy is alive, then we are going to update the enemies as long as they are within the current viewport. Okay, I hope I got everything in here. Okay, so tile is undefined. So let's move tile to the very top so that we define it before we're using it in monster. Okay, monster template. Oh, okay, let's get rid of that one. We've got two of them somehow here. Okay, let's double check that we've updated our startup combat. Okay, we did. And then we want to add our draw player stats to our player function here. Okay, so in the map.c, we haven't maybe declared, okay, spawn monster to map. So we never actually declared that, right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and do that now. So in map.c, maybe at the top here, and let's declare it spawn monster to map function prototype. And then back in map, okay, so we've got we're passing in the map, a pointer to the map, as well as the X and Y position. And so then what we're doing is we're going to create a random monster. So get a random value between 0 and the monster type count, which is that array right here. So either goblin, orc, slime, troll, or wraith. We're going to set the number of enemies to be the number of enemies from the map. And then we are going to reference a random monster from that array. And then what we're going to do is grab the number of enemies from the current map and then use that as an index into the enemies array of that map. And then copy in the newly grabbed monster name, max HP, basically all the stats of the monster from that monster template. And then we're going to increment that number of enemies index and then store it back in the map so we can keep track of it as we're loading enemies from the map. Okay, so we've got our build succeeds now. Let's go ahead and see what we can do. Okay, so we've got our XP of 0 showing up here. We've got our player being able to move around. And let's go find a monster. Okay, so we've got a snake showing up right here. Okay, or slime, sorry. So now we have a combat of 3 slimes. We can navigate through the combat list. Okay, and so the S, so we defeated them, but it's still on the map. Okay, and so it's technically, it thinks it's still there even though we defeated these monsters. So let's flee. And our random positioning happens properly, but okay, so I think I see what the problem is here. So we're not able to determine when we win the battle versus when we flee the battle. So in our combat, restore player to overworld. Okay, so we're passing in the X and Y, and then maybe what I want to do is pass in a Boolean. So if we flee, then maybe what I want to do is return a false to indicate that we are, that we don't remove the monster. How about that? So false. And then here on our restore player to overworld, let's create a, maybe is victorious. How about that? So are we victorious, true or false? So back in our combat.c, so we're not victorious when we're calling the restore player to overworld from the flee area. But otherwise, if we defeat the monster legitimately, then restore player to overworld, we're victorious. So true at the end of that. And then let's update this. I believe it was in map.c, is it? Oh, you know what? I can just control click, restore player to overworld, control click. Okay, now we add a new argument. Bool is victorious. Okay. So we increase the total combat experience. Maybe we should only do that if we are victorious. So if is victorious, otherwise we would like increase our XP even if we flee, which doesn't make too much sense. If we are victorious, then go through the enemy's array within the map, and if they match this overworld, like if they match where our player is returning to, then basically set them to that they're no longer alive. Okay, so otherwise we want to increase our experience, and we want to do all of this stuff in that else. Okay, otherwise I'm just rereading it and it's not making too much sense. So otherwise increase the experience. Okay, so if we are victorious, then we set the player XP, we increase it by the total combat experience, we mark all those enemies as dead, and then we set our player X to be the overworld player X, and player.y equal to be overworld player underscore y. Otherwise, so if we're not victorious, if we flee the battle, then let's randomly generate plus or minus 1 from where we were when we started the combat, and then set the player to that. Clean that up at all. Let's leave that as is so we can read it. And let's come back to this. Okay, so let's test this out. Okay, so we've got you know what? Let's add some more monsters. So let's open the map. Okay, let's spawn a monster right near the player. Monster type, sorry. Let's spawn a monster type right near the player. Okay, so we've got an orc here, I think it is. Okay, we go into combat. Let's flee. Okay, so we fleed to a square away from the orc. And let's now try and beat the orc. Oof. Oh, this is going to be close. Who do you think's going to win? Oh boy. Okay, so we've successfully won. We barely won. Our XP is now 29. We've increased it from the number of orcs that we fought. And let's go attack. Okay, so we have one kind of bug is that our player HP always regenerates back to full, when maybe we should leave it as whatever it is after the combat. So we've got 2 goblins here, so let's flee. Okay, our XP value didn't change. It stayed at 29. Okay, and I think that's it. We've got an XP displaying. We've got tracking within combat, and maybe we'll fix up that bug of the player's health some other time. I don't want to, I know it's so tempting to just dive in and fix things like this, but it may not be like a one-liner. It may be something a little bit more convoluted than that. And so I don't want to stretch out this video any longer than it needs to be. And the focus of this was to just display some combat to begin with. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had a lot of fun. I did, as we're building up this RPG brick by brick. Leave a comment down below on what things you want to tackle next. And grab the code from the description, my GitHub in the description. Like this video, share it across YouTube, let the algorithm spread it around. Subscribe to the channel for alerts on upcoming episodes. Okay, have a great day wherever you are in the world. Peace, everyone.